Start with a welcome from the Wilson Center, Blair Rubel.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm Blair Rubel, and I am director of the Comparative Urban Studies project here at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of my colleagues Lauren Hertzer and Allison Garland, I'd like to welcome you to the nation's official memorial to the 28th president. As some of you might know, Woodrow Wilson is the only American president to have a PhD. So when it came time to memorialize Wilson, Congress decided the best way to honor him would be to create an international center for scholars. As has become surprisingly controversial in the last few months, Wilson was an internationalist, and we are an international center for scholars. And the mission of the center is to bring together the world of ideas and world of public affairs, which is very much the spirit in which we're gathering here today for this meeting. I'd like to make particular thanks to Karen Mossberger from the University of Illinois Chicago, who's president of the section on urban politics at APSA, and Bill Barnes from the National League of Cities. They're the folks who really organized the panel today. And I have one task before I'm going to step down from the stage, and that's to turn the floor over to Bill. And that would seem to be a relatively simple task. But
I'm not going to like this, right?
I hope you do like this. I got to know Bill, I guess, about a decade and a half ago on a project. And I'm sure many of you in this room have had the same experience that I have had. Bill is really a rare individual. He is engaging and pleasant and smart, but he has what I always find to be the rarest quality in Washington, which is wisdom. And the number of times I've been in a situation with Bill where he has actually said something very wise is really quite remarkable. Not the least of which he once said it would be wise for a press to publish a book of mine, so maybe that's why I appreciate him. But I want to say that not too long ago I had reason to go back and read Bill's dissertation, which was for a PhD in history at the Maxwell School at Syracuse, where he went after he completed his undergraduate work at Oberlin. And the dissertation examined the emergence of a program in the District of Columbia during the 1940s. And I have to say that the Bill Barnes that I know was there in that dissertation. It was clear, concise, thoughtful, and full of a lot of wisdom, which unfortunately, given everything else that's happened in the District of Columbia since the 1940s, and since Bill wrote the dissertation, I only wish that more people had the chance to read it as well. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Bill.
You mean there's not more? Thank you, Blair, for that. I've just received, your chair has just received more of an introduction than I'm going to give our panelists. I told them all that they are sufficiently famous that you know about them, and so we will not take time to go through their biographies and achievements because that would take half of our time here together. I want to tell you about the process we're going to use, and then I have a couple of announcements, and then we will move through the discussion up here and then turn to you. The process we're going to use is that we have 4 presenters, one of whom is not here yet. Is Yvonne out there? Nope. When she shows up, we have a chair for her. Each of those presenters will have 8 minutes or so, and I left my kazoo at home. I had gotten it out so that I would be the timekeeper, right? And I just go meh when the time was up, but instead I have the dreaded amount of time left, and I will sort of wave these and people will ignore me, which is what happens in these situations. But at any rate, each of the 4 people, or 3 if Yvonne has been called elsewhere, will have 8 minutes or so. There are 2 discussants. They will have 8 or 10 minutes to reflect on what they've heard, and then at the end of that, in about an hour, we will turn to you. So we had a set of accomplished and wise people up here and a set of accomplished and wise people out there, and so we should be able to create a good discussion out of that. Around 6 o'clock, a little before, a little after, we will adjourn the session and move out across the way to the dining room where there's an open bar and refreshments, and we can share our insights with each other further there. I do want to thank Blair and his colleague Lauren Herzer of the Center for their help in setting this up. They've been terrific and very accommodating. Thank Karen Mossberger, who's been mentioned, and Mara Sidney and Michael Owens, who were the chairs of the program for the urban politics section, for their persistence in making this happen. And the Urban Affairs Review is the sponsor for the co-sponsor for the reception, and we will particularly thank Mike Pagano and Susan Clark, the co-editors, over a drink out there. So thanks to all of those good people, and thanks to the panelists. One thanks the panelists before they say what they have to say, right? And just a note, I asked that people not use PowerPoints. If any of you came expecting to see PowerPoints and you are addicted to PowerPoints, you better do whatever it is that you need to do to get through your addiction, because there are no PowerPoints here. As I mentioned, you may have picked up the sheet out in front that has everyone's name on it. I will just read them quickly in their titles and not go through bios. The speakers have implicitly agreed to try to keep within the time limits that I mentioned. I hope that when it comes your turn to make comments and ask questions, you will also keep within the time limit. And maybe I will hold up something like this and wave it at you if speeches begin to occur. So I think that is it. Oh, webcast. That camera in the back of the room, all you people out there, I'm pointing at you. This is a live webcast from the Wilson Center. It will be archived on their website. And so I ask the panelists and you all to speak into microphones. When it comes time for questions and comments from the audience, there will be Wilson Center staff, Lauren and a colleague, who will have these handheld mics and bring them to you so that your comments can be duly recorded for posterity. According to Lauren, once it goes up, it never comes down. So think about that before you speak. So, welcome, Yvonne. You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. Just
Glad to
got off
meet you.
a plane.
Oh. Yvonne just got off a plane. I don't know what else to say about that.
I'll say a few things, right?
Okay. We've just met. First time we've met. Okay, so we'll go in some alphabetical order here. Raphael Bostic to my right, Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Amy Liu, Deputy Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings Institution. Ron Leverage, the Mayor of Riverside, California, and the President this year of the National League of Cities. Yvonne Scruggs-Leftwich, Executive Director and Principal Investigator, Center for Community and Economic Justice. The discussants are Paul Peterson from Harvard and Margaret Ware at the University of California, Berkeley. Blair, is there anything, Lauren, is there any other announcement that I have to make about anything? The restrooms are out the door and to the left. Always important. Raphael, it's yours.
I guess it's showtime, and since this is, I don't think I was sensitive to the fact that this was for all posterity, so I'll have to make sure I'm more careful than I would have been otherwise. I wanted to thank Bill for the invitation, and this is a question and an issue that we spent a lot of time talking and thinking about at HUD, and I'm pleased that it's part of this conference, and I'm interested, very interested, in fact, to get feedback from experts on their thoughts on what we should be doing. The title is How to Help Cities in Hard Times, Advising the Obama Administration. Being part of the Obama administration, I'm happy to receive advice. So in moving forward, what I thought I would do is try to give you a frame for what kind of advice we're looking for and how it can be most helpful. And in thinking about that, Bill sent us a list of questions that we could consider as we were preparing our thoughts. And I'm actually not going to answer any of those questions. I'm going to pose a list of other ones, because I think that the real context for this in terms of giving advice is giving advice for what? And the what that I think we're thinking about is, what are the conditions that need to be in place in order for cities to actually improve and emerge from these hard times in a better and a stronger place. And once we understand that set of issues, I think that will point to particular answers that I think have important implications in terms of how the politics has to play out and how political science can inform our actions to make sure that things play out in an appropriate way. I'm also going to say I'm not going to speak to regionalism or metropolitan policy at all. I'll leave that to others. I know there are some others here who have fairly strong opinions on that. But with 8 minutes, I don't want to go too long. So the first thing that I think we have to do is ask a few key questions. And I think there are 3 key questions that I'm going to focus on. The first is, what do cities need help with generally? The second is about leadership, and in particular, how do you find it or create it? And then the third is, how can federalism be an asset, and how can we leverage it to be more productive? So in the first question, in terms of what do cities need help with generally, this is one of my soapbox issues. I will not use a soapbox now, except to say that I think there are 3 things in this context, in hard times, we have to be particularly mindful of. The first is the issue of self-awareness. I think it's an issue that doesn't get focused on as much, but the only way that cities are going to change and move into a different trajectory is that they have to have some clarity on where they really are, and that self-assessment has to be accurate and real. You need to know what your assets are. You need to know where the positive assets are, but more importantly, you need to know where the negatives stand. And because whatever strategy you have is going to have to deal with that. And you're also going to have to think about your opportunities. And all of that will require a degree of self-awareness that many places, particularly struggling places, don't step back and try to achieve. The second thing that they need generally is coherent and empowered planning and land use. There is already a built environment for many of these places, and part of the issue is, how do we restructure, repurpose, and rearrange things to leverage these opportunities and strengths that we've noticed. And then the third issue is preserving capacity. So in order to actually do the plan, you have to have capacity. You have to have resources in place. And so preserving it is important, but a closely related question is, how do you respond if the capacity has actually been lost? So how do you recreate that capacity? And I think there is important work and contribution that can be made. So those are some key dimensions in the first issue. In terms of leadership, I actually think that leadership is more important in hard times than it is in other times. In good times, you really just need caretaker leaders who don't mess things up. In the hard times, you need leaders who are going to be active and actually take the city someplace. And hopefully that place is a positive place. And so we collectively need to think about, how do we activate those leaders? How do we identify them? And how do we empower them to be effective? And I want to emphasize, these leaders are not necessarily public sector leaders. They can be in the private sector. They can be nonprofit as well. So one of the questions, I'm an economist by training, so leadership is not something that we study a lot. But I think there is a real question about can we recognize leaders? Can we identify the people who get it? And can we convince them to actually be leaders if they do get it and are not? How does that process play out? How does that work is something that is important. Some questions that I have been struggling with is, do we think there are enough leaders out there? Are there enough diamonds in the rough that we just need to uncover them and to let them do what they do? Or is there something that we need to do to catalyze and spur leadership in real ways? A second thing that we need in terms of leadership are people who can translate ideas and theories into actual things, into initiatives, into programs that everyone can get behind. There's a huge political process and an engagement that happens here, and that's going to be required if we're going to move forward. Because in all of these instances, we have scarce resources. We're going to have to pick some winners and some losers. They're going to be the places we invest in, the places that we don't. And if we're going to do that effectively, we're going to have to build consensus in real ways. And that is inherently a political process. So we have to manage that effectively. And then as a side note, and this is something that we've been struggling with, is measurement. So how do you measure leadership? How do you, if we were externally going to assess these places, how do we tell if there are enough leaders or not? How do we tell if we have to do and go to extra lengths to make a difference and to put in a capacity structure that can lead to change? So those are some questions and issues around leadership that I think are particularly important. The third issue I wanted to highlight and talk about is federalism. Now, I mentioned that in the leadership discussion that we need to give them knowledge. We need to give them energy. Federalism, in many ways, can be a major impediment to this. I am now in the federal government. I came from private school. The difference in the ability to actually buy a pen is remarkable, right? It's remarkable. And if you think about these cities, these complex systems, and the different ways that they have got to engage, all the different rules, all the different structures, someone coming in and being effective in this is almost impossible to imagine, right? It's a miracle when it happens well. And so as we think about federalism, we have to figure out ways to make it an asset and not an obstacle. And I would just say one of the challenges is that, and I've seen this in Washington just at the federal level. I can only imagine what it's like when you deal across level. There are so many different decision makers. There are so many different people who have to be brought along that getting bold things done, and particularly in hard times, we're looking for sort of larger initiatives. This is a tremendous challenge. And so navigating that's going to be particularly important. I will say there are advantages to a federalist system as well. The federal government, particularly at the federal level, we have a lot of resources, and we often have a broader perspective and can be an information conduit to get more done. So I think a key challenge here is getting the right information to the right people at the right level of government at the right time. And if we can do that, then we have no problems. So in short, I think we have a lot to do. We have a lot to work on in that regard. This is quite hard. It has been done, and you can think about disaster recovery as an example of this. We've had some good episodes. You think about Nashville, Tennessee floods. You think about Rhode Island. We didn't hear any complaints about those responses. That's a sign that things actually work pretty well. But in other instances, it's been quite a challenge. In an urban context during hard times, it's going to be very difficult. And if you think about the disaster recovery, in the urban context, we've got to repeat this again and again and again. This is something we've got to replicate. It's going to be an incredible challenge. So cities have to learn to manage and thrive in these federalist systems and move forward. I'm at 0, so I'm just going to summarize, because that's pretty much where I am. So I think if we're going to create a successful urban policy story, we're going to need to have all of these elements. We're going to need to have a city that's done its upfront work, has been honest with itself, and recognizes where strengths and weaknesses are and what it can and can't do. You need to have a place that has a leader or leaders who have the energy and the skill to galvanize resources and create political consensus. And you need to have a knowledge and ability to leverage a federalist system And we at the federal government, I believe, have got to make things easier rather than more cumbersome. Now, admittedly, all this is a very tall order, but I think it's a very necessary one as well. And I look forward to the advice we're going to get on how to achieve it. So thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Amy?
Great. Good afternoon. I thought whoever wrote up the description of this panel discussion did a superb job, raising a whole range of questions that I thought were quite provocative and very hard to answer. But I chose to address my 8 minutes around two of the questions that were in the description, which was, one was on, are there any ideas coming out of the think tanks, and I'm from a think tank, on how to aid the economic recovery of cities? And then second, is the nation ready for a metro-focused urban policy? And since this is about advising the Obama administration, I'm going to direct all my eye contact at Erica and Raphael. Okay, first, the need for economic recovery of cities. This is a very important topic because that is the challenge of the day, is the recession that we're in, and a recession that is lagging and may actually enter into a second dip. I think the phrase economic recovery of cities has itself an internal paradox, and that is the fact that the economy is not city, it is regional. And, as many of us know, and it's actually not national. In fact, Michael Porter had a great quote at a speech he gave at an event not about a couple years ago that said, there is no such thing as a national economy. There is only highly specialized, highly interdependent, highly interlinked metropolitan economies across the globe. And so we all know that because we know that firms draw workers throughout a metropolitan area. Firms in a region, in a cluster, certainly don't acknowledge municipal boundaries. And so the question is, if the economy is regional, it goes to my second point, is then how do cities meaningfully rebuild their economy and actually meaningfully contribute to regional economic growth? And one way to think about this is also, how do you put the UD back into HUD? And, we work with cities and municipalities all the time. And I think the challenge is that a lot of the conversations about economic growth and where the economy goes often happens outside of municipal action. So how do we connect those dots? And I think you can. So first, what do? Obviously, and NLC has done great work on this, but we know in the near term we certainly need a second stimulus that gives direct fiscal aid to cities, not just to states, because we certainly in the near term cannot make things worse. But the reality is, for all of us, the ultimate goal is, how do cities help build the next economy, the one that's going to emerge post-recession, that doesn't reflect the challenges that got us here in the first place? So, for instance, how do we be more reliant on exports and not just on domestic consumption? How do we focus on innovation so that we continue to be a world leader in cutting-edge designs of new products and new services? How do we be a leader in the low-carbon economy and not cede that to a lot of our global competitors? And as we do this, how do we do it in a way that opportunity is certainly shared by all? Because certainly the recovery right now is we're seeing productivity gains, but not with any benefits to the worker and or into income gains. And so if that's the conversation, it tends to be the conversation that doesn't speak directly to municipalities oftentimes because of the tools we give in municipalities. So I'm going to be blunt and say part of the challenge or the problem is that we need to update local economic development policy. And we have to update it because we are stuck in an old way of doing things. And that is, we still, in many respects, at the local level, think of economic development as attracting the firm inside our boundaries, even competing within our metro area, or we are still really focused on the deal, building things, whether it's the stadia, the waterfront redevelopment, the industrial parks. It's not to say that those are not important projects, but at the end of the day, that is not where the real economy lies. So if cities really wanted to be more active players in the future of transforming the regional economy, I think they have to rethink their tools and rethink the role. And So what does that mean? First of all, I think we have to understand the metropolitan areas and cities exist primarily because of their economic function. That is what makes a city, that's exactly what a city is. It is the combination of the assets of the infrastructure, the locational assets, the firms, the workers, that all bring these things together to create that economy. And when you look at a metropolitan economy, that's actually made of two parts. What people call the tradable sectors or the export sectors, and then the local serving jobs. And many of us know that oftentimes the export jobs, which is the jobs that bring value from outside of the region, the incomes into that region, those export jobs tend to create 2 or 3 local jobs. So every time you lose an export job like an auto job, you lose 2 to 3 local serving jobs like a grocery store or a dry cleaning and so forth. And export jobs matter because they tend to pay more, oftentimes $20,000 or so more than local serving jobs. And so we have to focus on those export sectors. And so the question is, how do municipalities, how do cities, how do counties help grow, nurture, and support the key export sectors of their economy and grow them, not steal them from others, so that they capture a larger share of such economies within their boundaries. And I'm going to talk about some tools in a moment, but I do think that there are some cities who have done this well or thought about this. I'm going to give you one example. Is anyone here from Cincinnati? Okay, so Cincinnati has an initiative called Go Cincinnati. This is just a city-based effort, but what I really liked about the effort was they had 3 goals driving their city plan. And the first goal was they needed to increase the receipts from their tax base. And they know that to increase their tax-based revenue, they had to focus on both income growth and real economic growth. Second, they wanted to grow export jobs and industry cluster jobs, not just any job, because I think most folks just look at jobs for any sake. And third, and these all had numeric goals to them. The third was they said we actually had to capture a larger share of the region's growth in these sector jobs, because we know that cities in the end are losing their share of the larger regional economy. So how do they actually not only contribute to it, but capture a larger share? And they did that by a couple things. One was primarily linking their land strategy to clusters. And so the 2 ideas I had on how we do that is, I'm looking for my 1 minute. Okay, good. Oh, good, I've got time. But one is that, what cities do well is they do development and they do land. And the question is, we shouldn't just be, we should be more proactive about how to link our land strategies to the economic clusters in the region. We talk a lot about cities and metros understanding what their strengths, their industry strengths are. Many places, particularly those that have been impacted by the collapse of the auto sector, like Detroit and others, are thinking about, if we do a cluster analysis, how do we ensure that that vacant land or that the amount of land that we have can be used to match the needs of those sectors. So in Cincinnati, what they did was they looked at their cluster strengths and they said, okay, then based on those strengths, what is the physical land demands of those sectors? And if they're entrepreneurs or small businesses, we don't, the one thing that we don't have for firms is we don't have enough capital for everybody. But the one thing that cities can offer is they can offer land. They can offer a space for someone to open up a business. They can offer a place for someone to locate at a good price. And, there it is. So I think that we have to think more strategically about the land. The other is some that we're hearing from other European cities, is that cities should be using their economic dollars not just to build things, but actually to support the process of innovation. In terms of R&D, perhaps, workforce development, growing entrepreneurship, and even export promotion of those clusters. These are things that cities can participate more deliberately so. I didn't get to my last question, but I'll say this really briefly. Is the nation ready for a metro-focused urban policy? We can certainly leave that answer to the Q&A discussion. But I would say we are not fully there yet. But I want to correct the phrase. it's not just a metro-based urban policy. We need to get to a metro-based economic policy. We need to get to a metro-based infrastructure policy. At the end of the day, this is making sure all of our national priorities run through a place-based metropolitan lens. And I think the Obama administration has made great strides in this way. We can talk about that in the discussion. But the biggest barrier to that here in the U.S. for a metropolitan approach is really the cultural divisions between municipalities in our regions. We still have too much dialogue or even identity that pits cities versus suburbs versus rural areas. I think that it implies that local leaders and regional leaders need to continue to lead by example to really unify us all around these shared metropolitan goals.
Thank you, Amy. Ron? Just talk.
Bill, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here and to think about the topic. I'm going to share perspectives. I put down some 10 points. I'll do this very quickly. They are integrating the perspectives of a mayor, a professor, and also president of the National League of Cities. I should just give a quick personal profile. This is my 31st year in elected office, 14 as a council member, 17 as a mayor. I received a PhD in political science from Stanford in 1965. Heinz Ulau, former president of APSA, was my mentor and tutor. As I was thinking about this, I have never met another mayor or council member who has a PhD in political science, but certainly there are not many of us.
You and Woodrow Wilson have a lot in common.
I am on leave, in effect, from UCR now, where I've been teaching since '65, but I still teach one course a year. And as to my own personal politics, I am a Robert Kennedy Democrat. Second point, and if we had more time, I'd like to talk about it, because I've thought about this a lot, is the relationship between the policy research in political science and what difference it's made to me as mayor. And I must say, it is pretty modest and pretty disappointing. I think we need to figure out ways in which the best of academics and electeds and practitioners talk to one another, but I think that's another topic. I would offer the challenge that I've been to way too many conferences, but I was trying to remember how many conferences I've been where fellow political scientists have been the chosen speaker. And the answer is not many. Riverside is a city. We're 300,000. We're halfway between downtown LA and Palm Springs. All mayors point out that you're doing good things, but we do have a balanced budget. We have something like 40 million reserve out of 190 million in our general fund. And in many ways, I think the city's never looked better. We also face 14% unemployment, which has been steady, and we're one of the centers for foreclosure in the country. Fourth point is this is not simply a hard time for cities, and I can't just, in my own judgment, overstate. This is the worst time since the Great Depression. I mean, there is enormous pain out there in some 19,000 cities and towns of this country. NLC estimates that there's, the next couple of years, going to be between a $56 to $83 billion shortfall. Recent major study between the three major local organizations suggested there's going to be some 500,000 public sector employees of local government which will be losing their jobs. Point is, this is not an abstraction. There is real pain. I think the most difficult time for cities since the Great Depression. Fifth point is that it matters what happens in cities and towns. I see Peter Arcus here from Governing Magazine, but there was a recent article that talked about that we were 1/8 of the economic sector, and that if cities and towns don't work, it's very difficult for the national economy to work. Sixth point is that the Obama administration has offered the stimulus package, which I've said is the largest package in the history of the world. And cities quite frequently ask, where is all the money gone, and what difference has it made? It has been some help for the cities, but I think for the most part, the federal government outsources this to the states, and that the direct impact on the cities has been quite modest. I was trying to think in my own mind how many times locally were you could have the bands play and the people cheer and with a specific project that you could identify, and they are very few that I can identify. And I think the focus on states and somewhat is miscast, and there needs to be a much more explicit kind of funding approach for cities. Seventh, just as a personal example, and is with the energy funding choices of the Obama administration, this has been the signature of in many ways, of the Obama administration. We're trying to get DOE to process we identified some 20 major projects, $30 billion, jobs, alternative energy, and hard time getting it through the DOE. There's a PACE program, which tens of thousands of green projects across the city are now on hold because of the decisions of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And one of the transformation grants of the Obama administration, the ARA, has been the energy block grants, in which the administration has chosen not to fund for a second year or third year. I don't understand why that is the choice that's been made. Eighth point is that if you look for the major issues of our time, you find them in cities, their jobs and the economy, their energy independence and climate change, their transportation infrastructure, their immigration reform. Federal level, none of the markers for these are particularly good. Going to the question of where do we go for help and what next, just three very quick points. One is the very difficult relationship between states and cities. I was recently in Florida at Florida's League of Cities and Towns annual conference, and one of the expressions there, what happens in Tallahassee should stay in Tallahassee. That got the biggest applause line of any of the comments made at the conference when I was there, but it's reflective, I think, of cities' positions across the country. Second, the idea of metropolitan regions and how to connect them. There's a lot of talk, but so far, particularly no resources have come. And I regard cities as making rational decisions if there are choices for them to make decisions about. The third is just that it may be more infrastructure, but the investment in maybe something like the investment in high-speed rail. I mean, why not catch up with the transportation system we find in Asia and Europe? I know Richard Florida calls for it in his book called The Great Reset, which is worth an afternoon on a hammock to take a read at. Finally, two last things. One is from California, and I don't mean the city of Bell, which is it's a small, poor city of 37,000 people, and in some ways, I think has the potential symbolically of being equivalent to what was Ronald Reagan's welfare queen. It is an atrocious, outrageous story of what took place in a small town next to the city of Los Angeles. But in California, despite its more public governance difficulties, there is one piece of legislation which is beginning to take form, and this is what's called Senate Bill 375, which is really to get regions to talk to each other, cities to talk to each other in regions. It's really the first time this has occurred in California. Greenhouse gases is sort of the marker for this progress, but it won't work if there isn't particularly some kind of incentives and resources. This is obviously a kind of more marathon than sprint, but without some kind of federal involvement in terms of incentives and resources, you get into defended turf. I mean, everybody defends who they are and what they're about, and so that's my quick reflections on life from the point of view of a mayor, somebody who's spent a little time in the academy and also as president of the National League of Cities.
Thank you, Ron. Yvonne?
Thanks. I wanted to comment on having just landed by saying that since I retired from my professorship in February, pardon me, and moved from Washington to Florida, my friends have said that I'm giving the concept of retirement a very bad name and that I ought to settle down and act, but I can't do it, and I couldn't resist this invitation. There are two anchors to my comments. The first is this book, which I wrote a couple of years ago. It's called Consensus and Compromise, the creation of the first national urban policy under President Carter, where this was in 1978 and 79, and so we do have some kind of template for what it takes to care about cities, and at that time we didn't call them cities in trouble or in need, we called them cities in distress, and they were statistically assessed as being distressed by all of the academic institutions you might think, including in the government, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Treasury. So we do know how to do this. And the other anchor is the amount of time that I've spent in the last decade facilitating at the local level conversations about cities and what we can do to help them. I was the deputy mayor of the city of Philadelphia from 1985 to 87, and that was after having been the Deputy Assistant Secretary and the Executive Director of the effort to create the first national urban policy, which we did. I was a deputy at HUD. So I, having done this kind of conversation quite a bit, I knew that I'd be tempted to comment on my august colleagues' perceptions, and I said I was going to resist that until the discussion period. And I'm going to do that by taking a few excerpts from an essay which I wrote a year ago, in August of 2009. And I just want to, I'm going to do that because I don't want to see this 1 and the 0 come up before I'm finished. The name of the essay is President Obama's Policy Priorities Affirm His Commitment to Urban Communities and Neighborhoods. And I talked about conversations that I'd had with people in the administration, including Adolfo Carrion, who at that time was the head of the White House Office of Urban Affairs. And I said that this is a White House that gets it, and this is a president that gets it, that cities are important and that we ought to take this opportunity to focus on them at two levels. At the federal level, with policy leadership, which has been mentioned, and at the local level, recognizing that leadership emerges. It's sort of like the old saying, build it and they will come. We don't have to worry about where the leadership is. There is plenty of it out there. And I said neighborhood revitalization is a grassroots experience about which this president knows a great deal firsthand. Community organizing, which expands the stakeholders' investment in positive and creative neighborhood change and stimulates an authentic public voice, is the tool which President Obama used effectively during his early career in Chicago. Thus, a top presidential policy priority was the creation in February of 2009 of the White House Office of Urban Affairs, which Mr. Carrion heads. Cities are vital engines for renewal of families, for reinforcement of civic engagement, for individual participation in governance, and for economic advancement. Cities are the natural laboratories for creating change in the perception and reality of personal responsibility and for improving life chances of many of the poor and racial and ethnic minorities. If cities are these critical engines and laboratories, then neighborhoods are the basic unit of measure for assessing and generating urban revitalization and change. Relief for joblessness and neighborhood distress will depend upon direct involvement of residents working in collaboration with private businesses and local government in a mutual benefit relationship rather than the more conventional dominant subordinate model. Building trades unions and other institutions which have practical experiences with apprenticeship training, will be critical to the initiation of quick, locally based training initiatives in collaboration with union construction industry apprenticeship trainers. Partnerships which benefit residents and unions can be forged through access to skill training, which prepares single parents and unemployed grassroots women and men for living wage jobs. Urban centers offer the first line of attack springboard for job creation because of their immediate reflection of improved economic status, their availability of human resources for training, and also their abundance of infrastructure needs. The mayor mentioned green jobs, and I speak of green jobs and green projects as being more easily able to be piloted in inner city neighborhoods because so much of the physical environment in these locations is obsolete, substandard, and or vacant. So there are a few recommended things which are known to have worked successfully in exactly the kinds of urban neighborhoods where the need is greatest today. One proven and effective measure for providing jobs, upgrading job skills quickly, and for giving immediate help to families on the verge of becoming or who already are homeless is to combine housing and neighborhood upgrading with job training through tools similar to the earlier Concentrated Employment Training Program, which we know, some of us know as CETA. There's some in the audience, as I look around, don't know it as anything because they weren't born. It's a myth that CETA was a failure. Quite to the contrary, CETA may have worked all too well for local political power brokers because it recalibrated and improved the relationship between working people, local employers, and local governments, changing the life chances of all three urban stakeholders. And I go on to talk about why CETA was successful, not only because it did the things I said, but because it represented a collaboration of departments of the federal government. Labor, Commerce, Treasury, Transportation, and HUD worked in collaboration with local and state governments. Again, the Obama design for urban affairs. And such efforts as something called Targeted Tandem and the Urban Development Action Grants are models of federal-local collaboration which work. The complementary tools of work development, training, and economic development could be focused on infrastructure repair and replacement, and there are other examples. Third, school community collaborations with neighborhood residents in the form of lighted schoolhouses, for example, offer a model for state and local education departments' collaboration with private sector businesses and nonprofit social service agencies. 4, and there's more that to be said about each one of these, but 4, child care and adult basic education can join forces to offer many different role models directly as a part of the neighborhood lifelong learning environment. For example, skilled trades trainers, business people who are venture partners in various neighborhood development actions, clergymen and women offering social assistance and social services, and other examples. 5. Meanwhile, job training is organic to all of these activities. Sheltered workshops are the model with the tested university involvement, for example, Temple University in Philadelphia, with surrounding neighborhoods and informed by such successes as the late Reverend Leon Sullivan's Opportunities Industrialization Centers. 6. Another example has been piloted by the Milton S. Eisenhower Foundation and the U.S. Department of Justice, creating co-bans and safe haven programs across urban communities where violence is one of the deterrents to return gentrification that's positive and rebirth. There are other recommendations growing out of successful demonstrations of things that work across the country in cities like Philadelphia, Cleveland, Oakland, Houston, Atlanta, Columbia, Savannah, Raleigh-Durham, Washington, D.C., and St. Petersburg, Florida, where I'm spending my time, and I agree with the mayor. What happens in Tallahassee ought to stay there. These citizen and nonprofit-driven local action initiatives, which already are in existence, are just the tip of a nationwide social change group of icebergs, and they should be replicated before they melt. I think that the involvement of the federal government is indispensable to the survival of cities, but I think also the governors, the National Governors Association, the League of Cities, the Conference of Mayors, and the people who live in cities ought to converge for a change and create a collaboration in the states and the cities where people care about cities. And that's not all states. I just want to remind us, there's no one-size-fits-all in saving cities.
Thank you. These people who have numbered presentations are daunting to the timekeeper, right? Because she said there's 6 items, and so she did six items. So who the hell am I to get in the way of that? Okay, we now move to discussants who have brought their own things to say, but I hope will reflect on what they've heard so far, and then in 20 minutes we will turn to you all for questions and comments. Continuing the alphabetical order in this category, Paul.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. It's great to hear these very thoughtful remarks from those who have been on the battle lines and close to the battle lines, because I sit at a very long distance away. And so what I have to say, I think, will be from a broader or more distant perspective. I wrote a book in 1981 called City Limits, in which I said that cities, after all, can go bankrupt. But they seldom do. They're very responsible. Well, not New York City. Drop dead Gerald Ford. You remember that. But apart from New York City, and that doesn't really count, it's not part of the United States, cities are really quite responsible. Well, that was then, back in 1980. So I just, on the way over here, dug up some data on debt, and because that's where bankruptcy comes from, right? U.S. debt, back in the year 2000, 5.7 trillion. I just realized that I used to write M's, 5.7 M, and then B's, 5.7 B, but I've never done T before. So this is really a new phenomenon. 5.7 T, 5.7 trillion back in the year 2000 is now, 2008, it's 10 trillion. That's the last official U.S. Bureau of the Census statistic. And of course, we're going to be doubling that very quickly if we haven't got there yet. So that's U.S. debt. That's just to give you an idea of the bigger macro story. And then if you take state and local debt, back in 2000 it was 1.5 T. And then in 2008 it's 2.6 T. I don't know what it is in 2010. Is it getting towards doubling that? I don't know. Might be. And then I looked at unfunded liabilities, pensions and other benefits. And there wasn't any in 2000. At least the accounting people didn't perceive it, so they claimed none. By 2008, there's 1 T, 1 trillion. And if you look at California, Stanford has put out a report on California that since then, it's doubled in California. If California is representative, I don't know if California is. They're very, except in Riverside, they're very irresponsible. So maybe it doesn't quite apply to everybody, but my guess is it applies more than it doesn't. So then that means that it's 2 billion in unfunded liability. Now remember, The U.S. debt in 2000 was 5.7 T. So this is a huge number, a huge number. And conversation earlier today, I was told by a colleague that he just got a letter from the president of his university out there in California who said, look, at the pension program is going to take as much more money than all the money that we're going to be spending on the university within 5 years. So we're going to have to do something about that. But the plan that he had was clearly, from my point of view, was not going to work. So I don't know what the next plan is going to be, but this one is not going to work. And then not so long ago, Mayors Daley and Bloomberg were at the Kennedy School, and they were behind closed doors, so they were speaking more frankly than they might otherwise. But they basically said the biggest thing that's going to hit us is the unfunded liabilities. The pension thing is just it is so huge a burden that no matter what else we do, if we don't do something about this, we're just going to be crushed. So. And I thought it was very interesting that, and historically speaking, state and local governments never got themselves into terribly, the debt thing it go up and down. There was cyclical debt and so forth, but it never really was sort of got out of hand. And this is sort of a new phenomenon that's taken place. The cities have, I would say, not been responsible, not realized that they, unlike the federal government can print money, The 10T or 20T that we have for the federal government, not a good thing. Don't want it. Those numbers are getting massive because they're getting us back to World War II numbers. Last time we got numbers like this at the national level was in World War II. And then we had this wonderful period from at the end of the war down through the end of the 20th century where basically the federal debt went to zero. When Clinton was in the last years of his office, I think the federal debt was down to zero, and that was a steady decline over a long period of time. But in the meantime, they could print money and take care of this, and of course the U.S. economy was so powerful. Now, so if the U.S. economy gets back its mojo, all of my concerns might be just concerns and nothing to be. But if the economy is not going to have the fantastic 1990s back again, then the question is really how serious is this going to be, and what do cities really have to do? And I would say cities have to become responsible. They have to manage their employees. They have to manage how much they're going to pay their public employees and run their public services. And if they don't do that, all this talk about the other things that they could do and the money they're going to get or not going to get from the federal government isn't going to make a bit of difference. The things that city governments really should be concentrating on is providing high-quality services to their residents and doing it in an efficient manner. And that requires attention to your public sector employees, whether they're your school teachers or your policemen or your fire officers or your whoever it is that's providing city services. You want that. And if that is done, the rest will happen. It will come, as Yvonne said. People will come if you have a well-run city. I still think Giuliani he made lots of mistakes, but he did make the streets of New York safer, and it really had a very positive effect. And Mayor Daley's of Chicago always kept their eye on services, and it's not like the schools of Chicago are wonderful. But there's a lot about the quality of public services in Chicago that has made that city survive over the long term, but much better than other cities and Chicago faced very similar problems to other industrialized cities in the Midwest. So then I read recently the proposal by Chris Edley, the dean of the law school at Berkeley. And Margie Weir may be able to elucidate more on this, since she's a colleague of Chris Edley's. And he proposed, he sees the same thing. That's a huge thing. It's a massive problem. And he said, this is the way we can handle everything. The federal government should loan money to the states and the cities and let them borrow as much as they want, and they'll pay it back on a rainy day. And it's now a rainy day. When the sun comes out to shine again, they can pay it back. this will stimulate the economy, and it'll get rid of all this debt, or at least they won't have to finance it on the open market, and so on. And I was meditating on that and thinking, this is absolutely an astounding proposal. And given the size of the problem, it's a proposal that's likely to come down the pipe. This is not going to be just sitting there in an op-ed piece in the New York Times. It's going to become something real. And so then I thought, well, if that happens, that is going to totally transform our federal system, because then cities won't have to be responsible, states won't have to be responsible. They can just borrow their money from the federal government, and it'll become a federal government problem. And then the federal government will figure out, ooh, that's what they're up to. So then we better regulate them some more. So we'll have more and more regulations coming out from Washington and controlling the cities. And the whole idea of an autonomous urban sector, an autonomous local government sector that we really have enjoyed as a nation for over 200 years, that will be something that we can remember, not experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Margaret?
I'm so happy to follow my former professor, Paul Peterson, with whom I do not always agree. And I try not to spend my time responding to Paul, but I'm also pleased to be here. Bill, I have 6 points that I want to make. And the first one is not about buying a pen at the University of California, but I concentrated on the hard times part of our charge, and I want to say a couple of things about that and weave in some reflections on what the panelists said. And cities in hard times. And so the first point that I would like to make is that hard times hit places unevenly. And we talked about, is there metro? Does metro make sense? And I think our current hard times make it quite clear that it's not cities versus suburbs, but it's places that are getting hurt from the economy versus some other places that are more shielded. And so I think it puts into sharp relief that suburban areas are being hard hit, exurban areas are being hard hit by foreclosures, low-income suburbs that have low fiscal capacity, often places where immigrants live or other low-income Americans that have moved there recently. I'm thinking of the south suburbs of Los Angeles and not Bell so much as Maywood. Now, Maywood, maybe that's a good idea for them to contract their services to another city. Clayton County, Georgia, which has gotten rid of their public transportation system, so that the pain is felt in different places in the metro areas. The work of Amy's colleagues, Berube and Kneebone, showing that poverty is split between city and suburb. So I think that the facts of metro areas have changed in ways that we know it is no longer city versus suburb, but the pain of hard times is spread throughout metro areas, not evenly, but it's spread it's not just cities, but it's also suburban areas. And that brings me also to hard times and how they hit people unevenly. The national unemployment rate, Paul looked up debt figures, I looked up unemployment figures for this. The national unemployment rate is 9.5%. For African Americans, it's 15.6%. For young people, young workers, it's 19%. And the point that I would like to make is that this level of unemployment has a lasting legacy for places. And what it brings back to mind is the 1970s. The 1970s, unemployment in African American urban communities was around 25%. That was a decade of extremely high unemployment. What was it followed by? It was followed by a decade of people talking about the underclass and the growth of the underclass. Lurid attention to the underclass. If young people don't get attached to the labor force, there are enduring consequences for them. There's enduring consequences for people and for places. So, I mean, what I would like to highlight there is that this isn't something you can wait on. If young people don't develop that attachment to the labor force, it is harder and harder to bring them back. If people are unemployed for 4 years at a time or 2 years at a time, they become less attractive to employers. So I appreciated that the National League of Cities is supporting this bill that has like zero chance of going anywhere, the Miller's Local Jobs for Americas Act. But even though it has no chance of going anywhere, I think it's important to continue highlighting the importance of jobs. I think somehow the issue of the deficit has achieved so much more attention. If you look at public opinion, more Americans are worried about jobs than they are worried about the deficit. And I think it's one thing that an administration that may not end up having a lot of power in the near future can do is to highlight what the problem is and highlight that problem of jobs. So I actually love these calls for countercyclical revenue sharing. And it's not just my colleague Chris Edley, but Schiller just had a piece in the New York Times. Glazer, I mean, he wants to put conditions on city if the cities, maybe they can publicize the wages of their police chiefs, et cetera, as a way to, promote good, show that the transparency and good governance. But I just think that in the short term, being able to keep people attached to the labor force is a critical urban issue. And let me say something then also about what Amy said. But of course, Amy is right, that in the longer term, we have to build up our ability to export. And we need a different narrative about urban areas, that they're not places that are just waiting to get a handout from the federal government, but they are the economic engines. And I would just add one short thing, that when you talk about export sectors, that is not just manufactured goods, but we can build our export sectors in services. I was just talking to someone about a plan that some local people put together in Macomb County to have part of Shanghai University be located in Macomb County. And actually at the University of California, we have lots of Norwegians who are attending our classes because Norway has a lot of money, and so we bring them there, and so there's ways in which some of our strengths that are service strengths can also be leveraged to be part of our exports. Just highlight that. And then I guess I just make one last comment that's not quite 6, but in deference to Bill.
lost count.
Yeah. In deference to Bill. I recently read an article by the historian Michael Katz about urban, what's going to happen in urban areas. And he was talking about historians and how historians have only narratives of failure about urban areas. There's lots of historical books that are narratives of failure. And I think that the same thing is not really true of political science. To address the political science question, I think political scientists do pay attention to local mobilization. They pay attention to efforts to, what people are trying to do in urban politics. But I think there is less connection to urban policy, in part because we've had this sense, well, there hasn't been urban policy in 40 years, something that you've written about, Bill. And so and then it makes me reflect on Raphael's point about leadership. We know as political scientists, we don't study leadership because that's not scientific. But I think in some ways what you are saying about leadership is that we don't know how to think about how relationships should work across the federal system. And part of the task of people in the federal government is to find appropriate partners who can push forward the agendas at the local level, commonly derived agendas. And I think, and this is actually more of advice to political scientists, that reviving that study of the relationship across levels of government, the relationship of bureaucracies, looking at the way local groups connect to various federal policies. And this is kind of the final point, and which is that urban policies, and actually this relates to the mayor's points, many of the most important urban policies, we don't have the label urban, but it seems likely that the problem in Bell, California would not have occurred if there had been immigration reform and you had more people who were citizens and could exercise democratic checks on what city governments were doing. So a whole range of policies that are not specifically urban policies, I think, are things that should be fodder for political scientists to study so that we can provide more evidence about constructive kinds of leadership and those relationships across the federal system. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, Margaret and Paul sort of brought us full circle back to some of the points that the four presenters have made. Before you start telling the folks up here why what they said is just dead wrong, I asked you to join me now in giving a round of applause to the whole panel up here. So now you had that little pause to think up your best question and pointed comment. So are there any questions or comments? Hearing none, I will adjourn the meeting. How about that? No. I want to, while you're thinking about that, I want to tell a story about Margaret's point about working in the federal system. A year ago, we had a representative from the White House at a National League of Cities board meeting, talking about the intergovernmental system, and afterward, the very wonderful director of the Colorado State Municipal League stood up and said why we need to do better at that, and he really focused on what's the problem here. And he said, and it really was not, it was a plaintive, sad voice. We don't even know how to talk with each other anymore, right? So it's an interesting challenge that Margaret put her finger on. Okay, enough stories from me, and I want to say that I never want to do this timekeeper thing again. Are there questions from the audience? Comments? Let's start with Dennis. Microphone. Sorry, Dennis. Tell us who you are.
Dennis Judd, University of Illinois at Chicago. I had the feeling that the comments on federal policy, I thought the comments were a little bit bloodless and technocratic, focusing, none of them really addressed the issue of what federal policy should accomplish. That is, what are the transcendent goals, as opposed to that we can help cities to balance their budgets and so on. At least Paul Peterson had a statement about a goal, which is that cities ought to provide high-quality services. In all of these comments, that's the only actual transcendent goal I heard, if that's transcendent. So there must be something I've missed, and I'd like you to respond to that.
Anybody want to respond to that? Transcendent goals?
So I'd be happy to speak to that. The first thing we did at HUD was go through a strategic planning process where we asked exactly this question: what's the mission? And I don't think our mission is actually a city-based mission. It's a place-based mission, and it's a mission that around how places and people interact to give people opportunity to realize the things that they want. So when we think about what we're trying to achieve, it is an open, equitable, affirming, and inclusive community that has the mix of amenities and opportunities that allow people to realize and activate their dreams and aspirations. And that may be a very high-level goal, but I think it is, for us, a place works when people can choose to live where they want to live, where people can choose to work with the jobs that they would like to, that the system gives them an opportunity to be educated and build the skills that they need to be successful and effective. And everything that we've talked about, and I think across the board, whether we agree with the actual dimensions or tools that one would use, I think we're all going to the same place. I mean, Paul's talking about a responsible city. Well, responsible means what? It means that it provides a foundation for communities, for people in those communities to live high-quality lives. Amy talking about economic drivers and capturing growth, and growth is not just, we don't grow just to grow, right? We grow so that people can live high-quality lives and enjoy the fruits of hard labor and benefits. So I actually think while it wasn't explicitly stated, it's been implicit in just about everything all of us have said. Maybe that was our error in just assuming that. But thank you for the question, because I think it is an important point to what we're trying to get to. And for us, for me and for HUD, it's aspirational and it's general about how people and places intersect.
Great. We have a whole program dedicated to that question, and we're 10 years in, and we're still working on the answer to your question. But here's our attempt at trying to answer it, because I do think that if there was an absence of urban policy, and then we had an opportunity to assert one, then what should it be and what should it look like? And I think one first premise is that our cities and our suburbs have changed dramatically since the last time we actually had urban policy. So we have to update our view, and a lot of the things that Margaret talked about with the changing trends reinforce that we are at a time where urban policy is truly metropolitan. We have to look at everything within a metro: cities, neighborhoods, older suburbs, mature suburbs, exurbs, rural areas within them. They're highly interconnected. Opportunity has changed. The opportunity structure has changed. The economic structure has changed. If the goal, and we know that all cities and metros are different, again, a point that Margaret made. So if the issue is we want our cities and metropolitan areas to be prosperous, because they are the engines of the U.S. economy. They are the framework of the nation. 88% of our Americans live in a metropolitan area. What does it mean to have a federal government help cities and metropolitan areas become prosperous? Well, first we know, and I know this is, all of us think about this, is we have to recognize that prosperity has multiple dimensions, and every time we travel to a community, they put different emphases on these aspects of prosperity, whether it's about economic survival, whether it's about the opportunity and upward mobility for its residents, whether it's about making sure we grow in a much more sustainable way. You go to Seattle, they care about sustainability. You go to Detroit, they're going to care first about economy and poverty. You go to somewhere else. There's all three of those parts of prosperity matter, but they have different emphases wherever you go. So again, we have to have a federal policy that is flexible enough to respond to those conditions. So what are the levers that affect those conditions? And the literature points to the fact that there tend to be four. This is what we call the economic drivers. Innovation, infrastructure, human capital, and quality places. They move productivity, they move income growth, they move the growth and development patterns, and perhaps the carbon emissions of our communities. And if we were going to put metrics behind those prosperities, I think that's why we look at these drivers. Okay, you can then if you look at those areas, there's policies behind each one of those. And the question is, how do federal policy give cities and metropolitan areas the ability to use their assets in a way that's going to help them achieve their stated goals on prosperity? So this, I'm going to close with this point. This goes back to, I think, the mayor's point about federalism, or a number of people talk about federalism. What's the federal role at the end of the day? We think that there are three. First, they have to lead on those issues that transcend metropolitan and state lines. Immigration reform obviously has a huge impact on our communities. We can't do that alone. Stimulus and economy, you can't manage that outside of a single jurisdiction. High-speed rail and infrastructure that again transcends. If we think about major infrastructure corridors of our country, the feds have to lead, and this is what the national governments in many other countries are doing. They lead on things that transcend metropolitan boundaries. But on things that are within the metropolitan boundaries, they have to push decision-making down. They have to empower, they have to create flexibility. And this goes back to what are the barriers that federal policies create that make it impossible for local leaders, whether it's elected, civic, or whatever, to get things done. And this is about recognizing that there's a lot of these problems are multi-jurisdictional, multi-sectoral, that we need to get out of our silos, and so forth. And and I think the administration has done a really good job of trying to recognize that. So lead on the things that are, lead on the things that transcend boundaries, push decision-making down that are within metros, and you can find examples within each. And then at the end of the day, we have to give our leaders the tools to measure their performance. And we have a federal system right now that is cutting funding for data collection, for benchmarking performance, for holding us accountable. And so I think that if this is where the private sector is going, I think where all of us are trying to hold ourselves accountable to outcomes, the feds have to give us the tools, whether it's technology or data, to do that effectively at the state and local level.
But Amy, just to interject, the system is pushing decisions down. That's happening, but we're pushing it down to people who aren't equipped to do things. So we can measure all that we want to measure, but we kind of know what those measurements are going to tell us if we're giving the resources to people who have not been put in place and given the ability to actually use that stuff well. So that's I think that the federal government does actually do. Well, you can argue about sort of the transcendent things, but the other two, well, the middle one, we do well, and then but we're trying to do much more metric measurement in our department. And the biggest complaint we get in the pushback is that you're going to have us measure, but you don't have tools and systems in place for us to actually achieve the things that we're trying to achieve. So you can give the decision making to people, but you have to do a whole lot more than that. And you have to do it in a way that can be generally replicated across a whole bunch of different contexts. And that's the area where I think we're facing a significant challenge.
Okay, I have two people who are patiently waiting to make comments about this question, and then some more questions out here. So
on the matter of whether or not there was a statement of what the expectation should be of the federal government, I assumed that by referencing President Obama's executive order in the creation of the urban task force, that I'm a political scientist by training at all levels, and I assumed that everybody knew that that was an assertion of at least the expectation of the role of the federal government with regard to cities. I think that it is all the things that people have said, but I think what is missing and has been missing for the last 40 years since I've been studying and working both in the federal government and in the academy, what's missing is an understanding of the difference between a place-based policy and what that drives and a people-based policy. And we had decades, James Sundquist talks about making federalism work, and Maris and Ryan talk about the Great Societies programs and point out that these were all people-based efforts. And it was not expected that cities would be the kinds of identifiable parts of the United States that, in fact, they have come to be. So that's one of the things that I would emphasize. It just seems to me that the whole notion of there being a policy that is driven largely by statistics sort of misses the point, because a lot of the statistical analysis that we have used in the past, used during the creation of the first urban policy the country ever had, and a lot of its econometrics that's being mentioned now, one of the problems has been that the people who really are going to make the difference in the quality of life in the cities are discounted, and their contribution to the image and the profile of the city is so marginalized that the statistics focus on they focus on the forest in a way that the trees don't even get acknowledged, and therefore they're not. We've talked about leadership. We're talking about public leadership. Most of the leadership and most of the communities that have survived and are showing some turnaround comes from the private sector, both nonprofit and institutional, as well as the public sector. And until we acknowledge that and realize that cities have a real independent contribution to not only the image of the United States, but the economic growth, we're going to continue to prescribe according to, in silos, according to this problem or that problem, and not for a city for it to remain viable.
Ron?
As kind of a defense or explanation for elected officials, perhaps. But when I ran for mayor, essentially the themes I had were safe streets, good jobs, and great neighborhoods, which are really questions of what's a good city. And you worry about what's a good city from the day you're elected to when you show up at City Hall. It's services, it's fairness, it's safety, it's access, it's opportunity, it's inclusiveness. We're also in this business, obviously competing. If you don't have the revenues, you can't be. It's very difficult to be a good city. But just two things. Just wanted to say. One is that in Southern California, for the first time, there is some kind of nature, real economic planning that's occurring beyond simply cities and counties, and trying to talk about regions. And it does need some federal attention and federal support. I'm always puzzled by, if you look at how much our federal government gives to cities, it is pretty modest. You compare us to top 50 nations in the world and ask what percentage of city funds come from the federal government. And I suspect of the top 50 countries in the world, we're probably if not at the bottom, very close to it. But this final comment is that Obama's the most urban president we can identify. 2 years gone by, which are usually the years where you get something accomplished. And I guess at this point, what advice, part of the topic was what advice do you give the president? And 2 years have gone by.
Okay. A personal comment to add in here. This question of whether city, as a city government, ought to be a focus of the federal government, or whether place, some combination of place and people, is the focus. I think you articulated that very, very nicely, sort of, and it's across the panel. Is a question. What's the relationship between this urban place concern and intergovernmental system? How do those fit together, or do they not fit together? It's an interesting kind of problem. I think we have gone back and forth up here, and I certainly go back and forth in my head. Questions? I know there was. No? Hal?
We have to mic.
Yeah, wait for the microphone. Sorry. To all you people out there on the webcast, we're waiting for the microphone.
And here is the microphone. I'd like to...
and you are?
I'm Hal Wallman, George Washington University. I'd like to invite Raphael to respond, in effect, to what Ron just said. What are the sharp differences in terms of what HUD has done from what has occurred in the past, not just the previous administration, but more generally? What have you done differently? And the second part of the question is, given the political difficulties which you have faced, and they're, I think, at least congressionally about to become, unfortunately, much worse, what do you have in mind to do over the next couple of years?
You're okay to answer this question?
This is for posterity, right?
Turn off the webcast.
I'll talk about that in two ways. One, I think, is philosophical. And then the second is there are a whole host of policies that we're doing that are quite different from what's been done in the past. And then I want to talk a little bit about moving forward, because the fiscal realities are going to be what they are regardless of what the outcome of the election in November is. And so there has been a pivot that's been necessary in terms of thinking about what's the nature of policy. But let me start with what have we done differently. From the time we got into office, I think our key theme has been empowerment at the local level, partnership with the private sector and the nonprofit sector and foundations, as it were, and local decision making, local context matters, right? It's explicit. So internally to our organization, we are working to devolve decision making and let our agents at the local field offices who actually have insights make some decisions and really empower that. We have gone to countless communities now, and we work with them in partnership. So we sit down with the city council, and we try to collectively find solutions. We're sending out technical assistance teams to communities to get them to use our money better, right? So we are actively engaging at a local level, recognizing the importance of place in urban places. And that's an important thing to say. The other philosophical difference, which is not just HUD, but it's administration-wide, is the notion that a single sector solution is not a real effective solution. So if you can take our Hope 6 program, for example, where it's a public housing program where we we demolish the public housing and we replace it with nicer housing with a mix of income, families within different incomes. Those projects are beautiful. If you ever have a chance, you should go see a Hope 6 project. But getting to the Hope 6 project is not so beautiful. So we wind up with these solutions where you have an oasis in the middle of a war zone, and the prospects for success moving forward are not very good. So what we're working on very explicitly, and I spend a lot of time on this, Erica Pothig, who is here with me, we spend a lot of interagency, intersectoral, coordinated solutions. So at the federal level, we're doing that with neighborhood revitalization. We have partnerships with DOT and EPA. We are working really to become a much more integrated, much less siloed government. And we are sending that message to localities. So we have a planning grant that we actually just closed from the Office of Sustainable Housing and Communities, where the winners are going to have crossed the silos. The transportation people are going to have to talk to the planners, right? And the planners are going to have to talk to the real estate developers. And that's a requirement for success. And that's a message that we're sending. And so we're trying to use our resources very explicitly to get to different kinds of decision making. And it's hard, right? So when I go talk with my colleagues from HHS, we have different procurement systems. We have different grantee systems. We have different cities that we're more or less familiar with. To do this well is a gargantuan task. And we are taking the very painful early steps in doing this, but you have to do it at some point. And I think that this administration and our department have very strongly stepped and committed to that. Moving forward, and this is where I think you come in, and I always like to talk to academic groups because you're out in the field. One of the most daunting things that I realized once I walked into my office and sat in the chair was, holy cow, this is a large country, and I'm never going to be able to talk to every person who might need assistance, who might need some technical skill or insights, who might have the skills that are needed. And so moving forward, what I'm hoping to do is really create or help, and what I think we're collectively trying to do is help create communities within the public sector that tap into resources that allows improvements and learning and the best practices and the like to diffuse through the system without requiring huge outlays of funds, right? That there has to be a collective community that's created that allows us to learn without me having to fly to every place or without us having to run a demonstration in every community in the country, so that as we move forward, we have these self-sustaining cycles. You know, one of the things I think about a lot is, you know, what is my department going to be like when I'm not sitting in the chair, right? And so to rely on individuals is risky. So if we can get this to be a much more systemic process, I think that there's a higher degree of sustained success and getting to the type of place that we're all trying to get these communities as we go through the hard time.
It does sound as if there are capacity issues at every level of government and then across the system.
Hal and I was Perry then, and I remember how we worked together on that issue. Can I just add something to? I think that HUD has to come to grips with the reality that as long as HUD is the only one doing these things, there's going to be pushback and there are going to be failures because people look at HUD and say, well, that's HUD's job, and they don't see HUD's leadership as representing the federal administration's priority, right? That was a problem we had in doing the urban policy, and after it was passed by Congress as official, was a terrible problem implementing it, even though in the policy, all of the agencies sat around the table. The main, my bosses were the secretaries of all of the HUD, all of the urban-related departments. So I think there needs to be more frequent reiteration of what was in that executive order, creating the urban affairs priority. The other thing, another hat I wore was as the Commissioner of Housing for the state of New York in Mario Cuomo's cabinet. And the thing that made that agency so effective, had its budget tripled during my 4 years as commissioner, was because the other collaborating agencies were required by the governor to constantly be present when the urban issues were being announced or being discussed. And even though they may not have done a whole lot in terms of following through, there was this image, the political card, the image that the governor was doing urban things, ergo the legislature was willing to increase the budget for where this action was coming from. And I think it's a fact of political life, and we have to see how we can exploit that.
Excuse me. I have not read Yvonne's book, but from just the way she's talking about this, I recommend it.
Thank you. All of you who teach, you find it a great, it covers the history.
Some sense of, my PhD is in history, so some sense of history always seems to me to be insufficiently present and urgently needed. There was another question? Yes, Ron.
Ron Vogel, the University of Louisville. I want to kind of piggyback on Hal's question a little bit and maybe push people because people are being a little too nice. I guess the question I have is, this great expectation was given to us that there was going to be an urban policy of the Obama administration. We created this Urban Affairs Council, and then at least out in the rest of America, we've never heard from it again. And then we do look to HUD to tell us what is our urban policy. We used to get urban policy reports, national urban policy reports, not saying they necessarily, we at least had a sense of what somebody thought it ought to be, or that an administration would sort of enunciate what they thought they were trying to do. And
Ron, why do you look to HUD?
Well, I'm saying it could be, I'm saying Well, HUD used to put out these national urban policy reports. At least I remember reading them. So I guess the question I have is, 2 years into this, if we were going to have an urban policy, it needed to be in the stimulus package. And I don't really see how, after the elections this fall, we're going to get much in the new. It maybe the panel should be, what do we want to tell the next presidential candidates and presidential contest urban policy should be, because this one's already passed. It hasn't it?
So I actually don't think
Somebody
so.
want to comment on, anybody want to comment on that? Anybody at all?
So I don't think it's passed. And you know, one of the challenges that we have is to do what we're trying to do. To if you're going to take this interagency engagement, if you're going to take bringing other people to the table seriously, there's a lot of background work that needs to be done, and much of that is invisible to the public, and it's an unfortunate reality. My hope, and this is posterity, so this is dangerous, of course, is that you will start to see things come out on a fairly regular basis for a while. I think we've started with our planning grants, which has been a partnership between the Department of Transportation, HUD, the Environmental Protection Agency, and just so that you know, we've structured this so that the review panels for all the applications have members of all the agencies on it. This is unheard of, frankly. But to do this and to structure these things, it's incredibly difficult. And it's been difficult to get the ideas right, and to where we find common space and common language. Then you have to write the things in ways that are airtight. And so there's been a lot going on. Now, could we have been communicating in the midst of this better? Possibly. And I'm not going to debate that. But I do want to say, though, that I do think that a lot has happened. And the other thing I would just add to this is the way our government is structured and the way we are funded means that we have real limitations on how we can do things in the first bit. So as we go forward, we're also trying to restructure these funding relationships that happen on the Hill, largely outside of our control. So this is a very, very heavy lift, and maybe we could be communicating it better, but I do think that there have been measurable improvements and achievements that you will see in the months to come.
We have a
Quick
quick comment.
I want to make one recommendation. It is that it was people like you sitting here who were invited with no grants to come and serve on task forces, and in exchange for using your expertise and your intellect to help us build the national urban policy. That explains how we got one. I would strongly recommend that the Obama administration begin to open up some of these think sessions to the experts from the academies and from the professional organizations, not town meetings. But the only way that the message is going to get communicated is through people telling others in their venues what is going on. And that was a very effective thing in getting the urban policy, and it was always in the newspaper, and it got passed by Congress. The hostage situation was one of the major things that kept it from being implemented. President Carter had to go and try to get the hostages out, and he lost the election. Everybody knows that history. But people were really behind the urban policy, and it was because we brought the public experts into the collaboration.
Ron?
Just one observation from somebody who reads all these reports that come across the desk. During the Clinton administration, there was an enormous number of reports from the Department of Justice. They kept coming at you, and it took, in my judgment, community policing, kind of outside concept, and put it in kind of mainstream kind of. We have not got that kind of repeated studies sent to us out in the hinterland.
Amy, quick.
Yeah, I was going to make a different argument, which this is a very interesting conversation and debate among all of us. And I think sometimes success would be if there wasn't an explicit urban policy. I don't know what people are looking for, and I know we're all looking for something, and I agree that we're only 2 years into trying to change a whole system. But at the end of the day, we know that this administration has been racked with some very major challenges and has taken on the economy and healthcare at the front end. And the question is, in all of this, and immigration may be next, is every decision they make, are they running it through the lens of cities and metros? And regardless of whether we call it urban policy. So in the stimulus package, even though it's not the best place to do urban policy, I do think there are some glimmers of things that cities and metros wanted. We've been arguing for high-speed rail for a long time. We got it. We got transit. We tried to push for fix-it-first transportation investments. You invest in existing places. We didn't get that. But we got some, I think some really catalytic investments that were really important to all actors within cities and metros. We didn't get the fiscal spending directly to cities. I know we're still pushing on that. It wasn't perfect. It was certainly a flawed bill. But I think that as we think about, there's an interesting debate. Who's the face of urban policy, really, in the administration? Every single cabinet secretary should be the face of urban policy. And I think one of the best urban policy folks out there right now is Secretary LaHood, because he's running around saying it's time to make sure that transportation isn't just about rural areas, but putting investments back to where our big population centers are. It's not urban policy. He doesn't run around and say, I'm giving an urban policy speech today, but I'm saying I'm making decisions based on where the bulk of our people are and where we're going to get the biggest gains on sustainability, on economic growth, on opportunity, on inclusion. And that's how they're going to do it. It's going to take a long time. And I think that for us, victory is there's no label, is that across every domestic policy, we will look at it through the lens of where the majority of us live.
Okay, we are running up against the time and standing between you and your free drink, but I'm going to ask for your permission to take a few minutes here. I'm going to take 2 or 3 short questions without getting any response, and then allow the panel, if they want, to take a minute or two to conclude the session. Is that okay with everybody? All in favor? All opposed? Thank you very much. That's what we're going to do. So here's a question. Is there another question? Maybe that, and there's a question. Yes, Ralph. So we'll take those 2 questions and then go back up here.
I'm Rolf Pendahl. I'm at the Urban Institute. My question or topic area of concern and interest is the capacity and ability of some leading state governments to play a very important role in the next 2 to 6 years and beyond. We've been wandering in the political wilderness for many years, maybe about 8, between 2000 and 2008, seeing not much action on urban agendas. And we fought very hard, many of us, to open up ground in states. And I think that in many cases, Brookings in particular, but others too, we're making a lot of very interesting progress, helping get states to think about their cities and metro areas differently. So the absence of the state level, both as a theorized level and as a level of action in this conversation is surprising to me, and I hope that I hope we don't lose it, because I think we learned a lot and we're close to doing some very interesting things.
Okay, last comment over there's right here.
Hello, I'm Chris Haney. I'm with the National League of Cities. In the earlier parts of the conversation, I felt like I heard 2 narratives of cities that my question for you is whether the 2 narratives are competing or whether they're complementary. And the first narrative was cities as economic engines for this country, and the second narrative was cities as providers of services.
Okay, 2 topics for food for thought. If we'll go, Paul obviously wants to respond to this, but everybody up here gets a minute or 2. So if you, and then we will conclude this session. So you can start, Paul, since you're enthusiastic on these topics.
So the Tocqueville said something about local government, And he really liked it. He thought that was the secret of American democracy. He wondered, could democracy work? Because he thought there were lots of problems with it in principle, but the Americans had solved these problems. And they solved these problems mainly because they weren't relying on a central government. They were relying on local governments to solve their problems. And but he worried that centralization would inevitably be a byproduct of democracy because every leader would come up with a great idea. And you can't do a great idea except through the power of the center. And so there would be an inevitable drift towards the center. So the question I have is really whether or not looking for a national urban policy is exactly the wrong thing to do. That really we want to preserve the capacity for decision making at the local level. That is the most important national urban policy to have, is for the capacity of local governments to survive. I think they're at risk today in a way they've never been before. And the risk is, I cannot imagine states, no matter what kind of leadership they have, coming in and helping out cities. They've got their financial problems so severe, they're going to have to work primarily on that. So therefore, yes, the federal government can print more money, and it can do a lot if it wants to, but it probably isn't going to. I don't really think it's going to. I think the pessimistic statements in the room are right. There is not going to be a national urban policy, but I don't see any reason for us to be terribly upset about that. What I think we should be upset about is the fact that we're not seeing strong leaders at the local level addressing some of the fundamental problems. There's a paper being presented at the convention which points out that if you ask people if they live in city, suburbs, or rural areas, what they think of their schools, of their streets, of their neighborhoods, of the safety of their community, etc., cities come out at the bottom on every single measure except public transportation. Cities have better public transportation than other parts of the metropolitan area. So cities have not taken care about the things that are important to people. Until they do, they're going to be in trouble.
Okay. Next, Margaret, let's go backwards. Let's go backwards from the way we started. So, Margaret?
I think the point that I would make is that it's not urban policy, and it's not simply, I appreciate the comment about preserving the capacity of local governments to survive, but it's a problem of federalism. And I also appreciate the comment about states, because the problem that California localities have, apart from mismanagement in the case that you talked about, we have a dysfunctional state government. And the problem of debt is not simply irresponsible wages, it's also irresponsible legislatures that won't increase revenues to support the kinds of services that people in California want. So it's a problem at every level of the federal system and the relationship between them. But I do think it's really important not to leave, even though we might want Tallahassee, what stays in Tallahassee to stay there. It's important that the states and their role in the problems that cities face be part of the discussion.
Yvonne?
I think that the importance of history has arisen in this dialogue any number of times in different ways, some of them more lighthearted than others. The mention of Mayor Daley, reminded me of a meeting many years ago between Mayor Daley and John Lindsay, who is the charismatic mayor of the city of New York, who talked about the philosophy of city governance and urban expectations and all those kinds of esoteric things, to which Mayor Daley replied, yes, but John, do you pick up the garbage? And so I think that's a kind of pragmatic balance that has to be found when we talk about cities, which leads me to point out that another historical reality is that one of the major elements of the urban policy, which came out in 78 and 79, was an urban impact statement, which was crafted in part in collaboration with Hal and at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and brought to the table. And so that's another example of how we might use the resources here. At the end of the day, our evidence is that the statement that drove the urban policy report, which came from the Greek city-states, was the determination to leave the city in a better state than it was found. And I think that that's what motivates those of us who sit here today, and also is what motivates HUD and this administration. And I think that finally, policy is a process. It's both an in-state and a process. And part of one of the elements of policy is the expression of normative expectations and goals, which leads to leadership. And we talked about leadership here throughout, and I think what we're asking of this administration is the leadership, not always the delivery, but the leadership, because everybody's got any sense is conscious of the many limitations, certainly the fiscal ones. The other element that the government has, the other element of a policy, has to do with supplemental action. And I think once there's an assertion of urban places as a priority, then supplemental action takes place, sometimes without announcement, as has been pointed out. I didn't know that anybody was vetting the supplemental proposals in the cities. And so it is the situational intervention of the federal government in the interest of an urban policy or a policy for places. I think that will probably inspire a lot of local action, maybe even by some governors, as recalcitrant as they sometimes can be.
Okay, Ron, you're next.
So I did 4 very quick things. One is just sort of a professional plea, at least as a political scientist. 2 ideas. One is if somehow the Urban Affairs Quarterly could be sent to maybe the mayors of the 200 largest cities or something, I think that actually would be helpful. It would be some distribution of what you do. And
there's an urban policy I can see.
Second is that there was a New York Times editorial on August 8th, Sunday, which said, "In search of a new playbook." And I really think at this time, if not a new playbook, the Obama administration needs to have a playbook that we can understand and rally around in the time that's here. Third is I think cities are really the laboratories of experiments and innovation, and states, I think, in many ways have had their day, and the future is very much, as Margaret said, I think quite doubtful. States have an important, in my judgment, important policy role in the future. Finally, is just that there's a kind of sense of sadness I have of being here about the Obama administration and its promise and its potential and what we were looking forward to. And I was just at a CAPCOA meeting, which is an organization of air pollution control districts. They had a conference on climate change, and these were the tip of the spear people, and yet there was many critical comments about the administration, who you would think that this would be the sort of champions of. And I was sort of haunted by one observation that came from somebody that one of the things that Obama had said in the interviews he had with his people looking for his cabinet was the question, we're going to take up health care first because there's a consensus. It will be easy, and after that we'll get to climate. And you wonder, in retrospect, whether that same judgment, if it had been different, if it had been climate rather than health care, what where would be. But I think people make choices, and there need to be choices both of opportunity and of strategy.
Okay, thank you. Amy?
Well, on the comment about cities as service providers versus economic engines, first I think we have to be very careful that when we say cities, we don't mean local government only. There are many multiple actors within a city that we need to activate. When you talk about leadership, it's not just municipal government, but many actors. When we talk about urban policy, it's not just policies that affect mayors and city halls, but also those that affect the university anchors, the nonprofit communities, and all the partners to those cities, government leaders. But I also just wanted, so I think that cities, they do have to be good service providers, but at the end of the day, they also have to put in place those assets that will help contribute to their economic function. But I just wanted to make a couple remarks, though, just about the city fiscal piece, because I do think that's, in this environment, fiscal distress and economy is all any of us are talking about. I do want to challenge the notion that local fiscal stress is purely adult due to irresponsibility of local government. I don't think that is true at all. It is true in some cases, but I think that by doing, some of these are just because of demographic change, aging, cost of healthcare, pensions that are outside of the control, direct control of local leadership. But I also think, and they're grappling with that, I also think that, there was in the news the other day that Harrisburg may file for bankruptcy pretty soon. The challenges that face Harrisburg is not so much about fiscal local irresponsibility, but really because it happens to be in a state that has high municipal fragmentation. And we all know what that does to the fiscal base of a municipality. The average size of a municipality in Pennsylvania is 2,500 people. When you create, and they are creatures of the state, when you are at that, it is almost impossible to find the fiscal solution out of that. This is structural about the way we create our communities, which is a state issue. So that leads me to the issue about states. We are at Brookings are going to, because of the election this fall, going to put a lot of our attention on the wave of new governors that are coming in this fall. States ultimately matter the most to cities and metros and so forth. They are always the hardest, as we all know, to change because most states are run by rural-dominated legislatures that are not as attuned to some of the things that we have talked about. But I do think we were looking, I'll just end with a brief note. I think for some of the candidates that are out there who are likely to win, because of some of the margins, we've looked at candidates at both Republican and Democrats who are likely to win, and there's a sense of optimism because the focus on economy has made a lot of governors acknowledge that they have to look at where their economy is. So it's really interesting that Haslam, who's probably going to be the mayor of Tennessee, his entire economic platform for the state is about regional economic development policy. And we see that in many of the states. The question is, how do you translate that in a way that is really meaningful and inclusive for those cities and engaging cities and all the regional leaders? So I think the states are hard. It's a long challenge because of the governing challenges there, but I think we use the moment of the economy to really focus the mind and organize ourselves, in all the ways that we've talked positively about.
Okay. Finally, Raphael.
So we are now 10 minutes past drink time. So I'm going to keep this as short as I can. I do want to say that I think the choice or the description of a city as either an economic engine or a service provider is a false choice. I think it has to be both. If you have cities that work from an economic perspective, but the services go to pot, it's not going to be an economic engine for very long. And there are a whole lot of places that could have the best run cities, but no economic power behind it, and they're going to be in distress pretty quickly. So I think that we don't have the luxury of having this as an either-or dichotomy, but rather we have to figure out how to do both effectively. I want to say that one of the things that I have really become very sensitive to is that the federal government has really significant limitations on what it can do. Right? It can provide a bully pulpit to get ideas and messaging out into the real world. It provides resources, but as noted, in the urban context, the way our system works is not going to be overwhelming levels of resource. So we have to be partners, and we have to find ways to leverage our expertise and the resources that we do have in ways that can be generalized. But I do think that as we go forward, and this is my charge and ask of you, is that rather than lamenting about the difficulties and the failures of various levels of the federalist system, or the highlighting sort of the difficult challenge or the poor decisions made by a city council in Bell, for example, that we turn to a more positive place where you highlight the relationships, the strategies, and the tools that then we can take to a whole bunch of places and find ways to make federalism an opportunity rather than an obstacle, and to have leaders that we can get in contact with other leaders so that we can create these networks that allow us to be effective as we move forward. We've got to be hopeful, or else that we're going to be a bunch of one-offs. And it's hard to imagine how that gets us to a place where we have sustained growth and engagement. So I hope that we can work together to actually do that effectively. And I look forward to talking to you in the drink session. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. On that, I have one piece of business, and then Blair Rubel from the Wilson Center wants to say one more thing. At 6:15 tomorrow night in the Marshall Ballroom South at the Merritt Woodman Park, the Urban Politics section will have its business meeting, and all of you APSA folks know how good those things are, and so you should turn up there. The last word goes to Blair, who will speak for 30 seconds.
Well, I want to first, again, thank Karen and Bill for organizing the session. I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Outside, there's a copy of a report which was the result of a 6-year series of seminars we ran examining global urban poverty. And that exercise came to mind this afternoon because at the very end, the very last speaker of 6 years of reports was Sue Parnell from the University of Cape Town. And we had asked Sue to look at all the papers and all the work and to evaluate it. And she began by making a very simple point, which I think is apt to our discussion today. She said, you know, when all is said and done, all these papers are fine. But ultimately, there's only one criteria that matters. Would I want my child to live in this place? And I think in different ways, that's the question everybody up here has been asking. And hopefully we'll begin to find positive answers to that question. And again, please join with me in thanking everybody.
Thank you.